The date is July 17th, 1950. 75 years ago, in a small room on Commissioner Street, a voice crackled through a radio speaker, and history began to write itself. A government had taken power 2 years earlier, the National Party, and with it, the machinery of apartheid. Laws, borders, silence, and a broadcaster that spoke only one side of the story. The newsroom, it was never neutral. It was never just news. It was a weapon. And that first bulletin was the opening shot.
Verbiede gevegte het gister op Korea gewoed, maar daar was geen verdere groot deurbrake deur die kommuniste nie.
The SABC was born in a time of separation. Its purpose, control the narrative. The stories, scripted. The languages, selected. The truth, censored. But people were listening, and slowly that voice on the radio began to shift. January 1st, 1962, Radio Bantu launches. For the first time, news is broadcast in isiZulu and Sesotho. Still within a system of control, but it cracks the wall.
My name is Sikibakiba Lekwati. I'm an associate professor of history at Wits University. Prior to the establishment of Radio Bantu, the SABC's news were basically intended to inform the listeners, specifically the white English and Afrikaans speakers in South Africa. The main reason why the SABC decided to expand into African languages was because they realized that many African people in South Africa did not speak English or Afrikaans. And so if they are going to catch their imagination, if they are going to control the hearts and the minds of the listeners, then they've got to get to them in the medium of their languages. It was really heated in the 1950s. So it made sure that in terms of the selection process of the broadcasters, it selected people who would not, pose a danger to state security. The news would be sent by fax to the region, where the announcers would be required to translate the news from either Afrikaans or English, and most of the time the news were in Afrikaans, into Northern Sotho, and then type them. This news would be typed, and of course in those days you'd have a carbon copy, right? As you are typing, you're producing two copies, a duplicate and the original. And the announcer would keep the original and give the duplicate to the controller. Now the controller was a white person. A white person who would be sitting, in the studio, facing the announcer as he's reading the news. But before the news went on air, the announcer would actually go through the original of the news, either in Afrikaans or English, and then compare the news bulletin with the translation in the indigenous language.
1971, the apartheid government finally grants permission for a television service. It had resisted it for years, fearing the power of the screen. 5th of January, 1976, the SABC goes live on TV. News on air, in living rooms. A new weapon and a new responsibility.
Van die volledige televisiediens van die SAUK.
By the 1980s, something new was growing. As William Ngube, a young journalist, reports for the first isiZulu bulletin. For the first time, stories were told in the voices of the people who lived them.
Inhlangano zokuthutha kuleli i-South African Transport Services ithi ixoshe abanye abasebenzi bayo abayi-985 1,885.
I was recruited around about 1980, 81 from KZN. When they came looking for people who will come and start and launch the black television stations, we went through interviews.
A second channel is launched, aimed at black audiences, but still tightly controlled. The cracks grow wider. Not everyone wanted those stories aired, but they aired anyway.
We found SABC 1 already running with their news and programs, which was white television station, and we were here to launch the black television station. So almost everything that you see around here was divided, separated. Studios, we had one for the white people, and they had to create some for the black people. And it was toilets, they had to create new toilets. Can you imagine creating a new infrastructure just because you need to cater for black people? So it was challenging. And remember, the object for starting the black television station was manifold. One of them was to try and convince black South Africans how good the apartheid regime government was to black people, which amounted to nothing else but propaganda. But also it was trying to quell the uprising that was already starting to simmer following the 1976 riots. There was excitement, but also there was this issue of you were always having this person behind your back who was checking on you as to what are you writing, what are you saying. They appointed white editors for us who claimed to know black languages. So there were white farmers who were editors who could speak a bit of Zulu, speak of Tswana, a bit of Pedi and Xhosa, and they were made editors to check on us as to what we're writing and the type of words that we're using. For example, when we talk of the ANC and all other progressive movements who were fighting against the apartheid at that time, we were expected to all time use the word terrorist translated in Zulu, so that it means Amaphegula's Khuni, not necessarily meaning people who were fighting for their freedom, but meaning people who were fighting against the government. They will pick it up from time to time, and then they'll know that you have started changing the words away from the harsh meaning to a meaning that was pro-Africans, and you'll be a target. You'll not get your promotions, you'll not get your bonuses, because they'll see you as against the state.
As the only radio and television broadcaster at the time, SABC News was the training ground for many young journalism graduates.
I'd come from Rhodes University and gone to Namibia, and things were starting to move politically here, and I was like getting itchy feet that I need to come back home. I don't know my country. Things are happening. And I remember coming, I was kind of like already burnt out at that age. I think I was about 22. And I stayed with some friends here across the road, and I was like, I wonder what happens in that building. And this was Radio Park, the Skyrise. And I picked up the phone and I phoned someone. I said, I'm in town. I just want to come and see what you guys do. And on the spot, there was a job offer immediately. And it was for radio bulletins. I got here 1st of August 1992 and worked for bulletins, and the first thing I realized was something was wrong. And I said to them, do black people work here? And they kind of all looked at me shocked, and they said, yes. I said, well, where are they? Because the bulletin desk was predominant, it was white. And they said, no, they work behind that section there. I said, what do they do there? No, they're translating. I said, they don't write their own stories. And that was a huge shock, because I didn't realize, coming here, what that actually meant.
When I arrived at the SABC, I saw that blue tapete. I'm sure many of you who work there know the blue tapete. I don't know what it's called in English, but it's that blue plastic flooring with the little circular efforts on it. And I was like, I'm here, my life is just about to begin. Because I don't know whether that blue flooring means anything to you, but it certainly, for me, was signifying my arrival at the SABC, my life, everything is about to begin. It was almost like I didn't have a life previously, okay? But to arrive at the commanding heights of our country's ideological apparatus was, for me, a huge moment.
In the other bomb blasts that have been happening recently, plastic explosives were the common denominator.
It was a very male-dominated and very much white male-dominated environment. And if I tell you, I did make coffee and I did make tea, and women weren't taken seriously at all in the news environment. So it didn't matter from what spectrum you came from, what racial group you came from. If you're a woman, you weren't taken seriously. To the extent that we had a referendum, and I can't remember what year it was, but we were told as women we would all stay in the office and we would work 24 hours in the office and we would write down all the results from the referendum. And I said, no, I want to be in the field. And they said, no, we could never allow a woman to be in a field. And there was a young guy that was in the office with me, and he didn't want to be in the field. So I went to my boss and said, well, if I swap with this gentleman, can I go to the field? And he said, as long as you promise me if anything happens to you, it's got nothing to do with me.
1990 was the year that inspired hope for many South Africans.
A salute from Mr. Nelson Mandela, his wife Winnie, greeting the people outside the fences of the Victor Verster prison.
The next 4 years were the historic years of transformation, both in the country and in the newsroom.
South Africa was on the brink of war, civil war. The two main areas were in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, predominantly the East Rand, Katlehong, Thokoza, Vosloorus, what we used to call Katuris. It was the ANC pitted against the IFP, the SDUs against the SPUs, and they were the defense units of the one and the protection units of the other. There were the political negotiations were taking place, and nobody was quite sure where this was going to go. And I think it was just, for me, the indiscriminate shooting, the indiscriminate death toll. We spent our mornings, our evenings, me particularly on the East Rand. I realized pretty soon that, these were human beings. They were not body bags. They were not someone just shot, and left to die and nameless. So that was really, really tense and very, very difficult. And we were teetering on the brink. I mean, it was also the Chris Hani assassination, literally took us to the abyss. We did the best we can, but it was it was highly volatile and very traumatic. And I think we as journalists never wanted to realize or acknowledge that it penetrated us, and very deeply so. And we're probably messed up because of that. And, you go from one to the next, and eventually you just get on this high of living on adrenaline. You become an adrenaline junkie.
Working at the SABC in the transition period of the 1990s was like war at close quarters. What happened is that there were so many debates about, what news is, what public broadcasting is, because we were all coming from different parts of a previously very fragmented society. So we had come from different traditions of journalism. Previously, your enemy is not your desk mate, and your enemy is not competing for the same prime time slot as you. What I learned during the transition is the kind of patience that negotiated settlements take from not just the country and its people, but from you as a journalist and as an individual. You cannot afford to get carried away with the moment. You have to be, if you're a public service broadcaster, part of being reasonable, part of balancing the story, finding the truth in all sides of the story, being factual, being independent, being sovereign in terms of what your take is on the value of the story.
Then came 1994. The ballots, the queues, the moment we became a nation. The SABC transformed, no longer the voice of the state. It became the voice of the people, imperfect, diverse, loud, proud. Newsrooms diversified, vernacular bulletins grew, anchors of every background took their seats. Under new black leadership, Snooky Zikalala becomes the head of news, leading a new vision.
The response to transformation itself, to diversify within the SABC, it received mixed signals. And some Afrikaans people are not happy with it because the dominant language was English and Afrikaans. And the Zulu African languages were despised. And even when it was a question of when you have line talks, where you're preparing for news, the African executive producers were not allowed to sit there. It were white people who were deciding, and black executive producers or black bulletins were just translating from white people. And so we made sure that we diversify that. That was very important for us. We made sure that the Ngoni Bulletin, every journalist who goes out will broadcast in 2 languages, in English and also in vernacular, one of the vernacular languages, if he's fluent in that, so that we become natural when you're on air, and you have to be proud of your language.
Imvodzakati yalobeka lisekela lamengameli Jacob Zuma beyitfula bufakazi ecaleni lakhe legagadlele enkantolo lenkulu yaseJozi lomuhla.
Endaweni ngendawo senamukela endabeni zantambama nje yini izibambe zisathunya intuthu ku-SABC1.
And so it was exciting. I was very firm, to be honest with you, because we have to transform the country, and it was very important that we transform this country. SABC is one of the organizations that was transformed in terms of racially. It was one organization that was spearheading transformation of the country itself.
But by 2006, questions return. Snooky Zikalala, now head of news and current affairs, faces accusations, blacklisting analysts and shaping news in favor of then President Thabo Mbeki.
Let's talk. Come on, let's talk.
Very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Asikuluma Let's Talk here on SABC1. Of course, our topic this evening, do you believe that the SABC is guilty of blacklisting certain commentators for their political views?
The time under Snooky was the late 90s. I was finished. We were doing the first 2 years of the Truth Commission. We were in radio, and he had been brought in to kind of start and run the Bi-Media project. We're radio journalists did TV and TV journalists did radio. And I had done some Bi-Media in Namibia, and I knew that radio was going to suffer, and I told him this, and he never spoke to me. But the time that, and he would often tell us as radio that we were bad and TV was great, and he told TV they were great and we were bad, and so kind of playing. But he merged the newsroom, which I think was a good thing. But overall, I think he had some insight to open bureaus overseas. I'm not quite sure they haven't lasted, except for Sherwin in New York. But I do remember, and it's not a great one, it's the censorship, the banning of analysts. And that the reporters and the presenters were told who they couldn't speak to. And that was a no-no for me.
There was no censorship. It was saying that you can't use one and the same analyst every day. What we saw that the analysts that were coming were being used were analysts who were taking stories from the newspapers. Because I used to read all the newspapers, and I used to be at work at 6 a.m., read all the newspapers. Now, when an analyst gave his own analysis, I could see that he got it from the newspaper, you know, and he has never been there. And when journalists go to a press conference of the ANC or any organization, those analysts are not there. The analysts will pick it up from what journalists are saying. They say, according to a SABC journalist, this is what happened at this press conference. I said, And so why don't you have academicians, people who are academics, and people who specialize on economy, people who specialize on violence, people who specialize on labor, And then we call them as analysts.
Being in a region like the Eastern Cape, you were away from the fire. So you didn't see and experience what everybody was telling you. But from my perspective, I was never once told that you couldn't carry a story. I was never once told that you couldn't interview someone. But I think over the years as a journalist, you realize what the role of the public broadcaster is. And you have to, for yourself, navigate some of those challenges. In that time frame, I think it was there censorship? Maybe. But did it affect me? Not at all. We still continue to do our job as we thought we did best every single day.
It's no longer something that is behaving like a public, community-owned, publicly owned asset. It's behaving like a fully privatized, commercialized entity. And so it means we're sweating every asset, we're working till late, and we are not getting paid. And it's just passion that keeps us rolling.
During my tenure, the SABC never suffered financial losses where employees were not paid. Now, people talking about expenditure, to bring about democracy is very costly. You have to pay for it. Secondly, what we saw an opportunity to have what we call a Pan-African news agency, saying that because we have bureaus in 10 countries, stories that we have, after we have packaged them, then you sell them to local news. Because that time the South African Press Association had to close down.
SABC Africa, the birth of a new channel. From Mozambican floods to the IFP-ANC war, from Mandela's final address to the World Cup. SABC News was there, telling the stories only we could tell. August 2013, 6 p.m. sharp, Channel 404 goes live. A new voice, a 24-hour presence.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's historic broadcast. It's not only the 77th anniversary of the SABC and the 37th anniversary of the first television broadcast.
To celebrate the expansion of Channel 404, that's our news channel, going right across the continent.
But then, a silence. Not from the people, from within. Under Tlhaudi Motsoeneng, protest footage was banned. Journalists were suspended. Truth was filtered again. But not all of them stayed quiet.
We support Suna! We support Suna! We support Kribani! We support Kribani! Proper news, not propaganda! Proper news, not propaganda! Left the suspension! Stop the censorship! Friday! Black Friday! Black Friday! Black Friday! Facebook candy!
So it's early one morning in the newsroom, and we're all seated around the round table. It's where all the national editors of the various provinces and the various divisions of the SABC newsroom are having a discussion about a particularly inflamed moment in the nation's history. So there were two things going on. There was the Pretoria on fire. The capital city was ablaze, and there was that Sputla, the ANC disputes over leadership in Pretoria. And the roads were cut off and it was engulfed, and the opposition were running helicopters and drones above the city. And we were told to de-escalate our deployment and our coverage of the inflamed capital city. We covered the war in the townships. We covered the war against apartheid as print journalists. You don't conceal conflict, especially armed conflict. And anybody who knows service delivery protests, when they barricade the streets and they burn the tires, that's when the people want to talk about what's aggrieving them. And we were now supposed to absent ourselves from that. No, that was completely unacceptable. And we raised that in a meeting. First, I objected to it, and then Futa Kruger objected to it, and then a younger journalist by the name of Suna Fenta, the late, she objected as well. And then it seemed like the discussion was just that they were going to decide what they wanted to decide in any case. But then we had requested to be recorded as dissenting because we had a feeling that the decision was challengeable in courts of law. So we didn't want to be on the wrong side of any legal decision on the issues. Besides, we just wanted to do the right thing. So, the following day, I think, we were all called in one by one. And by close of business, we had all been suspended, dismissed, or, well, with immediate effect, we were told that the organization had decided to terminate its relationship with us.
Do not focus on negative stories. Reporters at the SABC do not know the world. When they report, they mislead listeners.
The first set of findings we made, the Commission found that the SABC suffered from the capricious use of authority and power to terrorize staff and to deflect the corporation from its mandate and its editorial policies.
Again, there was this who can you speak to and who can't you speak to, and you can only speak to the ANC and you can only speak to certain people within the ANC. And the reason I'm saying it actually started in 2015, because if you had to speak to Thandeka came to me in 2015 and said to me, Angie, they're coming for you. I said, what are you talking about? She said, you opened your mouth. You opened your mouth and you told them it was not on, that they were beginning to tell us again who we may interview and who we may not interview. And they did. But they couldn't take me on that. I'd been at a Bosbarat and I mustered the courage to tell them it's not on what you're doing.
Hladi was a difficult era for all of us. He was a great journalist. I knew him in his career as a current affairs producer, and he had the ability to tell the most incredible stories. But you know, like everything in life, when you climb up the corporate ladder, your life changes and your requirements change. And when Hladi got to that position, I did interact with him. I was in charge of the Eastern Cape Province, and I was also quite involved with the coverage of elections. So we did have a lot of interaction. Hladi was very deliberate in what he wanted.
We're going to make sure that we deal with people who are not loyal within the organization.
And if you didn't fit into his vision, there was no space for you.
I joined SABC in 1989 as a freelancer. I was employed permanently in 1995. I was employed by the guy called Alvin Kloppers, who was very impressed about my work during those days when I was still in the Free State, former homeland, Kwakwa. I did not apply for the job. I was just given this job because of my streetwise maybe. What was interesting for me is when I joined the SABC, they were speaking Afrikaans, only Afrikaans. And Alvin Kloppers told me that when I joined SABC, the language at the SABC is English. But in Bloemfontein, it was a different ball game. I decided to speak Sotho. No one could hear each other. Amongst me and the white people, I caused row in the SABC during those days. Normally, white people, they will also send you for tea. I'm a journalist, but they asked me to do tea for them. I did for a week. The second week, the guy who was calling me to do tea for him, I sent him to do tea for me, a white person. I caused row.
When we report about the news, we are not apologetic about positive stories, because we as Africans, we undermine ourselves. Our own journalists these days, they deal with propaganda. And what kind of propaganda? When we were growing up, you have what they call people who are fighting for the liberation of many countries. Our own journalists talk very bad about their own country.
The SABC condemns the burning of public institutions and has made a decision not to show footage of people burning public institutions like schools in any of its news bulletins with immediate effect.
You can't just wake up and change policy. You know, there is a particular process that needs to be followed. You know, you need to also make sure that, you know, the public participates in any policy amendments at the SABC, and that was not followed. You can't have a person just, you know, deciding that this is how I'm now going to change things.
One of the more bizarre policy introductions that we saw coming out of the Cloudy Motsoeneng era was the policy around 70% sunshine journalism. And what we saw happening there was a force or a push to ensure that 70% of the news production coming from SABC was positive news. Now, the problem with that is that it completely ignored the realities that people living in South Africa are facing on a daily basis. You know, it was don't show so much violence, don't show protests, the ban on the coverage of protests. It's you know, it was bizarre.
Who came with sunshine stories? It's not me.
Oh, that wasn't your introduction. You did not introduce that.
No, it was Halabalu from media.
Okay.
In short, SABC, we are going to reflect Africa as Africa. We are not going to come with propaganda about negative stories, people killing each other, as if we are killing each other. Because if there is no water in Soweto, if you are a good journalist, you'll go to Orlando. There is no water in Orlando. But in Deep Kloof, there is water. That is what we call balanced story.
I am in charge. You must adhere to my instruction. President Zuma is the president of the country. I do not regard him as ANC. You cannot treat him the same. We will give him more time. You can question everyone, and you referred to Mr. Mantashe, etc., except our president. We need to respect him, especially you, SABC. I expect you to align with my instruction.
Look, what I said to news people at the SABC, I said to them, a newsroom should reflect South Africa as it is, but we need to build South Africa. That is what I said. The stories that we need to do, we need to make sure that you have human, interesting stories. Not just this chaos about people banning clinics, banning universities, and so on. Because if you are SABC, you read Broadcasting Act. I did exactly what Broadcasting Act says we should do, which is to educate, entertain, informed. I did those three. I said, look, if you allow people every time you show people banning clinics or schools or whatever, actually you're encouraging people to do that. Because I'm a journalist, remember. I talk from experience. All journalists know. If you go to a march, the community, they see cameras, they become different people.
We don't want this mayor and his council. They must step down.
I did not compromise any editorial issues at the SABC. Actually, I was doing the right thing, which I will do it today and tomorrow.
Now, the most controversial part of our work was looking at political interference. There was no direct line between the decisions in Luthuli House and the decisions in the newsroom. We couldn't face that line, but the spectre of the ANC hovered over the newsroom. Now, after hearing all the evidence, we concluded if ever there was doubt about the relationship between the SABC and the ANC leadership, Faith Mutambi and Hlaudi Motsoeneng, even after their removal from the SABC, traveled to Durban earlier last year to show support for President Zuma when he appeared in court. There have been more recent demonstrations of that.
We've actually got evidence to support the political interference that we saw playing out between 2013, 2016 under the Hlaudi Motsoeneng era. And that, I think, the surprising thing during that time was how blatant it was, how obvious the political interference was under Hlaudi Motsoeneng. So we've monitored every election since 1994, both national elections and provincial elections. And generally, SABC did and still does very well during an election period. And that's also because we have certain election regulations that come into force to guide and stipulate how news broadcasters should cover elections. However, in 2016, it was the first time that we picked up such obvious political bias in the news coverage of the 2016 local elections. And this was a direct result of the policies and the interference supported by Hlaudi Motsoeneng.
Who can influence Hlaudi? No one. No politicians could do that to me at the SABC. And I will tell you because people try everything. You see, if like people say Hlaudi was Zuma's person, Zuma. No, I was not Zuma's person. And I was not deployed there at the SABC like other people. I was not the employee of ANC because I was employed by white people. And my growth within the SABC is my hard work, no one else. If I was doing what the ANC wants, I will still be there at the SABC.
Your decision to not want to have the broadcast or too much broadcast time spent looking at the burning of those universities and the infrastructure and all of that, you are saying that that was not influenced by any political affiliation, is my question.
Yes, it was me, no one else.
I joined aware that the challenges of censorship, of political interference, of lack of adherence to journalistic standards, of diminishing quality, were a very complex problem, and they cannot be attributed to one person, namely Mr. Motsoeneng. It's a complex crisis that had beset public broadcasting in South Africa, and it's definitely not attributable to one person. Maybe he became representative of the multiple crises and the censorship because of his utterances and his actions.
The Labour Court rules 7 journalists must return. Their courage sets precedent.
The respondents' dismissals of the 2nd to 5th applicants are unlawful and void ab initio. 3. The 2nd to 5th applicants are entitled to return to work at the SABC and to continue with their respective duties and responsibilities in accordance with their job descriptions.
Their silence broken. Hlaudi is dismissed. Internal hearings expose the truth about censorship, qualifications and salaries. Patiswa Magopeni takes over. A new era begins. A rebrand, a new voice.
What is happening now is that the journalists within the newsroom have full accountability for what has to be decided in terms of who we cover, how we cover them, and how we reflect the voices. So what is being done is to restore the full editorial control of the newsroom to the newsroom.
a bolder tagline, independent and impartial. In 2020, COVID hits South Africa. The newsroom adapts. Parliament applauds the SABC's role in informing and educating the public. In the midst of the global pandemic, a dark cloud hung over the SABC. The organization's financial woes resulted in the retrenchment of over 600 employees.
We have been keeping this ship alive. Oh, yes. We worked during coronavirus. We were in wards every day with people who have contracted the coronavirus.
SABC Plus launches.
Even though we're going to progress into a digital environment, radio still plays a huge role. And the reason I'm saying that is based on languages. The social media environment is still largely English-based, whereas the radio environment speaks to people in their vernacular, speaks to them in a language they understand. And I think digital is the future. And I think it's got an even bigger potential as SABC if we can move our indigenous languages and our ability to broadcast in 14 languages into the digital era. I think then the SABC will be here for many, many years because of that strength.
The way that we've seen news consumption change and change very quickly, I think it's the fastest moving change that we've seen over the last few years in terms of how people consume their news on social media platforms.
We will be going beyond the headlines with in-depth discussions and insights into political party campaigns.
In 2024, a public watchdog confirms the SABC's election coverage was fair, balanced, and independent.
We thank also the media, and in particular the SABC News, who really have done a sterling job in keeping this nation informed.
Now, in 2025, the story continues. We report in every language, from every corner of this country. We are not perfect, but we keep going. We grow. We rise.
We were fortunate, very fortunate, to be part of a team that was history-making. We were making history. That was groundbreaking. You can even call us pioneers, because there had never been black TV news stations before. Now, coming back to the 75 years, I think it's something to celebrate. I think sometimes we take it lightly. We've got a number of other channels who have cropped up, who are now competing with the SABC. But we must never forget that that's the SABC that made it happen.
It started off as being a very closed institution that really gave no room whatsoever to the broadcasters, particularly the news reader, to go off the script. You know, they were required to say it as it is written on the script. The moment the, Radio Ndebele was actually established, it helped establish this as a language, and it quickly evolved from being a spoken language to a written language. So you have an interesting case of a radio actually starting and then helping develop isiNdebele as a written language. The Radio Ndebele announcers definitely played a very important role in the establishment of Ndebele as a written language.
I really believe that I'm a beneficiary of a longer historical tide, and I at the SABC have never been, even in the bad days at the SABC, I've always just been proud to be a journalist in public broadcasting, to be privileged by history to be at the SABC at any moment in history is to really be chosen.
Looking back at, as we became a democracy, the coverage of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings by the SABC was absolutely incredible and fundamental to, you know, that process. If we look at the coverage of the different election periods over the years, the SABC has been critical in moving our country through the very early stages of learning or finding our feet in a democracy.
I never regret for a single minute my decision to join the SABC. Over the 35 years, I've had lots of opportunities to leave the SABC. And a lot of people have asked, why didn't you? And I think it was because the SABC gave me, it fed me everything I needed in terms of my career growth. It allowed me to grow, to experience things. And I think that's the beauty of the public broadcaster.
From apartheid to democracy, from censorship to resistance, the story of South Africa lives inside these walls. We are SABC News, and this is our story.